full screen. Okay, so very good to be with you all today and talk about the commodity versions, the rice, the corn, and the dairy versions of ARMS. These are very important versions for us, particularly for developing commodity cost and returns estimates, but also for many of the research questions that we face. And so just to introduce myself to you, I'm Jeff Gillespie. I am the team lead of the commodity cost and returns team here at ERS. And I'm also the acting branch chief of animal products and cost of production in the market and trade economics division. And let Monty introduce himself to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Monty Vandeveer. I work with Jeff. He's my boss on the cost of production team. I've been back at ERS about a year and a half. Most of my working years have been spent with Kansas State University and University of Nebraska doing farm management extension work. So, in this spot and in those jobs too, NASA is a big supplier of data we've used a lot. So it's just a good time to say thanks for all you information you guys supply, and hope our talk today is helpful.
Thank you, Monty. So let me go ahead and proceed and just give you a little bit of the training outline as how we're going to proceed today. I'm going to first go through a bit of an overview of our ARMS commodity data program. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we collect commodity data, how we report commodity data, and then I'm going to talk briefly about our commodity situation in 2021 for corn, rice, and dairy. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but we'll have a few things to say about it, because that is the environment, of course, that we're going to be collecting these data in. We're going to then move to the questionnaire review, and that's going to be the majority of the time. I'm going to turn it over to Monty when we're talking about corn and rice, and he's going to go through the corn and rice surveys, and then I'm going to go through the dairy survey. I do have some dairy practice examples at the very end if we decide we want to go through those, if it seems helpful. And then I'll just say briefly where you can find the ARMS commodity data. So that's how I want to proceed today. Let's go ahead and jump into why we collect ARMS commodity data. So these ARMS commodity data support cost of production reporting mandated in the successive Farm Bill legislation ever since 1973. That legislation says we shall conduct a cost of production study of the wheat, feed, grain, cotton, and dairy commodities under the various production practices and establish a current national weighted average cost of production, and it shall be updated annually. And so we do that in the cost and returns team here at ERS. And we use these ARMS data in order to conduct those cost of production studies. And so it's congressionally mandated that we do this. And ARMS is the way that we collect these data and publish the analysis. We also use commodity data to support in-depth research into production ag issues that are important to a various number of customers and stakeholders. For those of you who are new and maybe not being quite as familiar with how we do this, ARMS is divided into phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 1 is basically a screening sample where farms that are still in production are identified, and it's determined that those can move forward for surveying. Phase 2 is conducted at the for crops only. We don't conduct a phase 2 survey for livestock. Phase 2 is conducted at the field level. So we choose a field on the farm and collect data on that field. And so this year, in the field was we conducted analysis surveys for corn and for rice. Phase 3 is conducted at the whole farm level. And that's the farm cost and returns, the CRR version, the dairy cost and returns version, which I will talk about in a little bit. And the dairy cost and returns version, phase 3, is the sole source of of ARMS data that we use for developing our dairy cost and returns. Okay. Now, as far as phase 3 is concerned, we also collect information, some additional information on corn and rice. Okay. And Monty's going to talk more about what those data will be in a little bit. But it's important that we have both. We had a question a few minutes ago about phase 2 and phase 3. How do you get people to respond to phase 3 if they're reluctant, but they've already responded to phase 2? We do use both phase 2 and phase 3 for our cost and returns analysis. So it's, if at all possible, we need to have both filled out. So we really appreciate you guys working with us to get both phase 2 and phase 3 filled out for those corn and rice farmers. All right, how do we report these ARMS commodity data? The first way we do it is through the commodity cost and returns data product, or the CAR data product, as I'll call it here. We produce U.S. and regional CAR accounts for 12 different commodities ever since 1975, and it's all on the ERS website. We also have state accounts for milk, so we'll have estimates for milk cost and returns for a number of different states that produce milk. This is all based on ARMS commodity surveys, as well as some other NASS data that we use in terms of prices from NASS QuickStats, as well as a few other places that we're able to get, but it's mostly through other NASS data as well. These commodity data are viewed and downloaded tens of thousands of times every year by a diverse clientele. Government agencies and officials use these, of course, in policy development. Any kind of policy you're gonna develop that has something to do with for a particular commodity. Most of the time, you need to understand what it costs to produce that commodity, and these cost and returns estimates can provide that. So government agencies and officials, extension staff use it, farmers, consultants, ag press. We get a lot of questions about these data. We also use these ARMS commodity data for our ERS research reports, charts of note, various staff analyses that we do with stakeholders throughout the year as well. And then also for extramural research, some of the research that gets published in journal articles and others that wants to take a little deeper dive into the cost and returns, or into maybe conservation practices or whatever. But this is how we report it. A little bit more detail on this. I just wanted to show you, this is how we report our cost and returns on the ERS website via pivot tables. This is the corn example. And I'm not putting this up here so you can look at every single number. I just wanted to give you the big picture. You can see what we have here. This is a pivot table. You see the gross value of production for corn listed, all the operating costs, the allocated overhead costs, all the costs, and then a net returns value down at the bottom. You'll also see it's a nice pivot table where you can pivot across various regions, the Southern Seaboard, the Prairie Gateway, all of these. Up at the top, you see base survey of 2016. That's the last time corn was surveyed by ARMS. And so what we've been doing is, since 2016, we developed a survey year estimate off of that ARMS. And then we've been updating ever since then, 2017 to 2020, with new prices, but based on that base year survey of 2016. You also see that back in 2010, we surveyed corn farmers. And we updated those through 2015. So that's how we report it. We report it in another way too. This is through data visualization. Here's a milk example. These are some of our milk cost items. It's just pleasing to kind of look at visually what these costs of production look like for the United States and for various regions of the country. You can see which the longer this bar chart, the higher the cost. And the different shades of blue, they represent different operating costs and how much those the cost of those inputs. And then for allocated overhead, that's like land and unpaid labor, machinery. The various shades of orange show the different allocated overhead costs. So you can see which regions had the highest cost and the lowest cost of production. So that's another way that we report a cost and returns on the ERS website. Another way we report this information is through ERS research reports. You can see 3 different research reports here. We have one on trends in production practices and costs in the U.S. corn sector. This was just published this year and using ARMS data from the corn survey. A couple of years ago, we published this one on rice, U.S. rice production in the new millennium, changes in structure, practices, and costs. And then just last year, we also published consolidation in U.S. dairy farming. I think Jim McDonald mentioned this one yesterday in his talk. And this just shows you some of the different ways that we report this data. And what's nice is that we can report it over time too. We'll have multiple years of collection, so we can look at different technologies that have been adopted over time, what the cost of production is. We can look at economies of size, those kinds of things. Here are some of the graphics that have come out of some of these reports. Here's one that shows for corn production, the last time we published one of these based on 2016 data for corn, shows that farms with greater corn acreage generally have experienced lower production costs per bushel. And you can see the 1996 ARMS data, the 2001 ARMS data, 2010 and 2016 ARMS data, production costs that were based on those ARMS data. And the light blue, that represents the smallest farm category with less than 200 acres of corn. The dark blue represents the more than 1,500 acres of corn. And so you can see that the larger, throughout all of these years, the larger farms have typically had lower production costs per bushel. We've done something similar in rice production. That was in the publication that we wrote a couple of years ago on rice, and you can see that here these little line graphs represent the production costs by size of operation and region. So you got fewer than 250 acres, rice acres, 1,250 or more rice acres, and you can see this how the larger farms generally had a bit lower cost of production. California split out from the southern regions. It's a different type of rice, short grain typically, versus the longer grain rices in the southern region. So we split those out. Here's another one that looks at dairy farm net returns per unit of milk and how those increase with herd size. And so the light blue at the bottom, that's the smallest size category of 50 to 99 cows. The dark blue at the top, that's the greater than 999 cow. And so you can see how the larger farms had generally larger net returns. And so this is another way we use these data from the commodity surveys. Let's talk for just a minute about the situation that dairy farmers, corn, and rice producers were facing in 2021, the year we're going to be collecting the data for. Just to start out here, of course, we know 2021 was not a one of the big differences, of course, was COVID-19, and that there were all kinds of reasons why that could be a year that's a little bit different from some of the other years. One of the ways is we've had increased input costs during 2021, and particularly at the very end of 2021, where some of the costs, the prices spiked at the very end. But if we look at the corn prices over the past 7 years, what you see is this graph right here that was on the NASS website that I just downloaded here. Prices received for corn by month. Back in 2012 and 2013, quite high prices. And then it's been settled below $4 really throughout most of 2014 and through 2020 into 2020. Started going up a bit, and 2021 has had higher corn prices relative to the last 7 years. So that's a way that the environment's going to be a little different this year in terms of corn prices for these farms that you'll be surveying. Where was the corn acreage located in 2017? This is the latest that I see. It's based on the ag census, and you can see where the acreage is, and where those acreage where that major acreage is. That's where we'll be, of course, surveying this year. Areas where you see a significant amount of blue, those are the areas where we're surveying for this year. What about rice prices? Well, they generally followed sort of a 4-year trend, as best I could tell. I downloaded these prices and plotted this out really for ever since late 2017 into 2018 and up until now. Prices have been sort of in that looks like for medium grain and short grain rice, in the below the $20 per hundredweight range, and then for long grain below that, really for 2021 in that sort of $13 or so range. As far as where rice acreage was located in 2017, you can see they're just in a few places here. Of course, Northern California. You'll see it in the Boot Heel of Missouri, and Arkansas is the #1 rice producer. Then some in Mississippi, quite a bit in South Louisiana, and then as well as Northeast Louisiana, some, and then also some in Texas. And those are the states that will be surveyed. As far as milk prices, they generally followed a sort of a 7-year trend, I would say. 2020, you saw some spikes there, but 2021, they've been sort of in that same 7-year trend as according to this graph. As far as where milk cows are located in 2017, you can see here they're all over the country, but certainly concentrated in California, Wisconsin, the Northeast, and the Corn Belt regions, and some in the Southeast, and then Texas and New Mexico, and as well as Idaho. And those are the places that we're surveying. Okay. All right, let me say just something quick about commodity specific questions that are common to all 3 commodity surveys. And this is just basic, it's just Section H revisited. We talked about Section H back a couple of days ago, or maybe it was Monday, I can't remember. I think it was Tuesday. And this is the operating and capital expenditures. And we're asking what are the expenditures here, 28, you can see for contract labor. And then we have a follow-up question. of those item $28, how much was for the corn enterprise? For our commodity cost and returns estimates, these follow-up questions are very important because this is where we get a lot of the data that we're going to be using for the commodity estimates. So it's really highly important that we get this information. This is not the only place we get the information, but it's one of the places. In some cases, we also get a bit of data on these costs. And in fact, we get most of these for corn and rice in phase 2, but we can also, it helps to have it here to sort of is a backup, but also to check and make sure that that we have the right, the correct numbers in terms of costs. Okay, I'm going to turn it over now to Monty. He's going to talk about questions that are unique to the corn and rice surveys. And I'm just going to, Monty, if you'll just let me know when you want me to advance, and I'll advance the slides.
All right, sounds good, Jeff. Thank you. As Jeff said, you see that first point there, all our phase 2 respondents, we're asking them to complete the phase 3 questionnaire. As Jeff was saying, it's a lot easier to get that cost information there from section H. Sometimes we can reconstruct cost estimates from our phase 2 answers, like fertilizer. They'll report, well, we use fertilizer A and fertilizer B and fertilizer C, and then we have to come up with a cost number and then kind of back a fertilizer expense number out of that. So, but that is a lot of work, and that may not be as precise a number. So, boy, it really is helpful. I want to reemphasize that getting those numbers on the phase 3 survey is a huge help. Now, the sections that are specific to corn and rice, there's a separate section for corn. That's section N that just asks some questions about the non-GMO or GE, so non-genetically modified organism or genetic engineered corn. Section O for rice, that's unique to rice. That's just collects data on irrigation. And then they both have a section on drying, section O for corn and N for rice. So those are the sections we're going to walk through step by step. So next slide. Okay, so first we'll look at that section for corn. That's the non-GMO section. Just a little bit of background. The non-GMO corn may have some specialty traits, or it may just be the absence of GMO traits that can give them a price premium over ordinary feed corn. And so that could be something like oil content or something else. Also applies to grain that's destined for certain export markets. For example, Japan will not accept GMO grains. European Union would only accept small trace amounts of GMO grains. So those are special categories, and the identity is preserved through the supply chain for these special products. And so this whole section is concerned about, okay, first, does the farmer grow this kind of corn? And then if they do, have they had problems with cross-pollination from regular feed corn or GMO corn that puts their specialty product at risk? And then some other questions about what are they doing to reduce that risk? So you can see here, number 1 is the screener, the yes/no question. Are they growing this type of corn? And notice that point, we're excluding organic corn. We asked about organic products in other surveys. We're not particularly interested in the organic corn in this case. So number 1 is the yes/no screener question, and number 2 is if they do grow it, how many acres? Number 3 is if they've had losses, then there's a table where they can report their 3 most recent years of losses. So yes, it's about how many bushels and what was the price premium that they lost. Now, notice that the price, they should not lose the entire value of the corn because they could always sell it for feed corn. But we're interested in that price differential, but that extra price they would have got the premium for their special trait they're trying to preserve. So that's question 3. Then question 4 asks about there's some new products now that have a gene blocking trait to prevent this cross fertilization. And so if they were asking first, did they use this type of seed? And then if they did, how much more did they pay for that seed? So that's question 4. Next. Some other questions on the corn, finish this section. This is about, first of all, did you do any practices to avoid this cross-pollination problem? So question 5 is a yes, no, did you do this? Question 6 was how much did this practice cost? And then there's 3 different practices you see there listed. One practice is a buffer zone. Second is testing for the GMO traits. And then the third is an open, any other practice they want to list. And so we asked, have they done that? And then how much did it cost? Okay. And then question 7, actually there's no question 8, there's a question 7 and a question 7A. And the question 7 is just a yes, no, did they get a price premium on their special crop? And then 7A is a question, how much was the price premium on those bushels? So that's the corn, the specialty section for corn. Any questions before we go on? Okay, all right, next. Okay, the next section then is drying costs, and this is in both corn and rice. And so they're referring, as we say here, just to grain harvested in 2021. And for reference, they've already reported that amount harvested back in section B. For corn, that's code 106, and for rice, it's item 126, if you want to look back at section B. So questions 1 and 2, 1 is a yes, no, did they harvest the grain in 2021? Number 2, what month was most of it harvested? Question 3 says, it's asking about how much was dried first at custom operation, second, how much was dried at home, and then the third question was grain that wasn't dried at all. So we're trying to get those 3 different breakdowns there. You can see the note at the bottom in terms of what's been the practice on the past surveys. Corn 2016, about half the producers dried their corn, and the majority of that was actually dried on farm rather than custom. And in 2013, with our last rice survey, most of the producers were drying their rice, but about 2/3 of it was dried off farm in custom operations. So that condition is going to vary every year. You know, what's the moisture content of the grain at harvest depends how much we need. So, but that gives you some point of reference. Okay, next slide. All right, more details about the drying. First of all, if you custom dried any grain, question 4 asks, what did it cost? And I think we can report that on a per bushel or per hundredweight basis, or they can report the entire total dollar cost. And then question 5, so if any grain was dried at home on the operation, we've got questions 5, 6, and 7, and 8 to answer there. So you see those listed. Question 5 is what type of fuel did the drying system use? Question 6 is what was the moisture content of the grain at harvest? And you can see the targets for both corn and rice there, what we try to get them dried down to. But that helps us get an idea of the extent of drying that was needed. Okay, so question 6 is moisture content. Question 7 is the labor hours. And we want to break this down into 3 categories: labor hours from the producer, labor hours from full-time staff, and labor hours from part-time workers. Okay, so broken down all those ways. Do not count any costs from custom hire. And the last question there is about the type of facilities used for the drying. So we've got 3 categories: bin system, custom flow dryer, and batch dryer. So we want to know what type was used. And then there's a part A: how many of these bins or dryers do we have? And then what's the total capacity in bushels or hundredweight? What's the capacity of these facilities? Okay, so that is the drying section. Any questions on drying? All good? Okay, let's jump on ahead. And the last section is going to be about irrigating rice. Now this map is irrigation acres everywhere. I think Jeff showed you the rice irrigated acres before in that other slide. So of course, rice is irrigation is a key expense for rice. So we're looking for a little extra detail on that. Okay, next. And so this is rice section O. There's actually a question 1 that's a yes/no screener. Was any irrigation done in 2021? And if they did irrigate, then we asked them to complete this table in question 2. Okay, so question 2, we're asking the rows. The rows in this table are the crops. So we've got alfalfa, hay, pasture land right there at the top, because we usually forget to list those. But then there's 7 blank lines for 7 more crops that may be irrigated. And it says there's an irrigation supplement of more than 7 crops were irrigated. I have to ask, is this in the respondent booklet? I'm not sure, but it would be a table just like question 2, just 7 more lines, space for more crops to report there. So the rows are the crops, the columns are the variables we're looking for. You see that second bullet point, the first 2 columns. One is which was the crop irrigated and what was the code number for it. Second was how many acres, irrigated acres, were harvested. And then there's what was the yield. And there's a yield unit too, bushels, pounds, hundredweight, whatever. Okay, next slide. And the rest of the table you see here, we have a column that asks what was the irrigation type. And at the bottom of that page, there's a list, like 19 codes. And there's 2 major categories. One is a gravity system and one is a pressure system. And there's like 10 pressure systems and 9 gravity systems. So if you're not familiar with that, might brush up and get familiar ahead of time. So gravity system, that's really important, helps us understand what equipment might be being used in that system. We need to know that to estimate the cost. Second item is how much irrigation water was applied, and that's reported in acre inches. You can see how much that is there. Next item is percent of acres irrigated using surface water. And you see the distinction there. Groundwater we pump out of a well. Surface water comes from a surface body water, stream, river, lake, or an irrigation canal too. So are we using water from, how much are we using from groundwater? How much is surface water? Then the last question there is what percentage of acres were irrigated using surface water that came from off-farm water suppliers? What we're interested here is the cost of purchased water. And this is a bigger deal, I think, in our Western states. So these farmers get, they buy their water from the irrigation district or some federal agency or some other group. You can see that list there. So this helps us get a good check on are we getting the right cost for purchased water, if we know how much of the water comes from these off-farm sources that they usually have to pay for. Okay. So any questions on the irrigation? Okay. Next. Any lingering questions, rice or corn, anything we've talked about here? Jeff's going to tell you more about the dairy, but again, appreciate the chance to see you folks and wish you much success in your work ahead.
Okay, thank you, Monty. Every once in a while, it seems to get stuck on, it won't proceed like I was hoping, but I eventually get it to the slide to proceed there. But thanks, Monty, for all your the information on crops. What I want to talk about now is the dairy questionnaire, and we're going to be talking about this for quite a while because the dairy survey. There are a lot of questions in the dairy survey that are unique to the dairy survey. So we want to go through each one of those. I don't post up the survey on the screen, so you may want to go along. If you have the survey up, you may want to go along with that as I'm going through this, just looking at the survey. So what are some of the costs that we include in the dairy enterprise? And this sort of sets the stage, I think, for why we're collecting some of the data that we're collecting and why we're not collecting data on some of the other inputs that you might think that we would collect for. So for dairy, we include all the operating costs, the labor, the machinery, the land, and all the other inputs that are used for dairy on the operation. What we don't include are the costs, labor, machinery, and other inputs that are used to produce feed on the farm for dairy cattle, like for instance, silage or hay or other forages and grains fed to dairy cattle. And the reason for that, we don't value those feeds on the basis of what it costs to produce them, but we value those feeds on the basis of what their market value is. Okay, and so if we know how much of that feed was grown on the farm and we have a market value for that, that's how we're going to value that feed, not on the basis of, okay, it cost, I put this much fertilizer and the tractor crossed the field this many times and all of that. Okay, so that's that sort of puts into context some of the questions I think that we'll be asking and the way we ask those in the dairy survey. We also exclude any costs, labor, and other inputs used for dairy cattle being raised on another operation unless we specifically ask for it. Okay. Instead, basically, we ask how much did you pay to have cattle raised on another operation, but we're not asking them, on that operation, that other operation, how much did they spend for feed and whatever. Okay. So those are some of the costs that we want to collect in this survey. So let's jump right into the dairy questions. We talked about Section H a little bit ago, and we do have a number of those where we ask. We get a lot of the input costs directly from Section H, but we get them from other places too. We also ask about quantities of total conventional and certified organic milk sold. And that's all collected in Section C, along with the cash value of milk sales. The marketing contract value of milk sales is collected in Section E. So we go to other places in the survey for information for our cost and returns analysis as well. Section K, for the dairy survey, there are additional questions about dairy labor, and that's questions K12 through K15. What we're asking there is hours per week by quarter that's worked by full-time and part-time labor. Okay, we ask in section H about what did they pay for paid labor, but we also ask here, we need to have this breakdown to understand what's full-time and what's part-time labor for the dairy enterprise. That's helpful for both a check, but also for some of the research that further research that we'll do on this. We also ask for wage rates for the full-time and part-time paid labor for this for any of the paid labor. We also ask hours per week by quarter that's worked by the principal operator and for other unpaid labor. This is very important. It's important for us to know how much time is being spent on the operation in terms of unpaid labor, okay? Whether that's unpaid family labor, whether that's the operator or whoever, we need to understand what how much time is going into that. From that, we are able to develop a cost of unpaid labor, which is it's an economic cost. It's not a cash cost that farmers. It's not an outlay that farmers put out on an annual basis, for labor, but it is an opportunity cost, and it is a very real economic cost in terms of what does it cost to produce milk. Okay. We also want to know what the percentage of those unpaid hours were performed by persons less than 16 years of age, and those would be valued at a different wage rate than for other unpaid family labor or operator labor. Okay, I will just say most of the cost in production information for the dairy enterprises is collected in sections H, which we've already talked about, as well as N through V. Do we have any questions thus far of anything I've said so far about the dairy questions before I move forward? Okay, let's move on to section N, and that's screening and inventory. And I have the survey up on another screen here, so I'm kind of going to be looking over to my right a bit and looking at both the survey as well as the screen here, the PowerPoint slides that I'm showing you. This first question in section 1, it's a screening question. It asks, were 10 or more dairy cows milked on this operation at any time during 2021, yes or no? And we need to have at least 10 cows that were milked on the operation in order to move forward with the survey. Anything less than 10, we don't need to move forward. We're not going to. We don't need those for our cost and returns analysis. So you can go ahead and skip to section W, the conclusion, if they didn't have at least 10 cows milked on the operation at any time during 2021. Question 2 asks for the largest number of dairy cows milked on the operation at any time during 2021. And we use this in order to understand that, if we know the total number of cows, then we can look at costs on a per cow basis as well. N3 asks the operation, did the operation produce milk all 12 months of 2021? And the operations must have produced milk in all 12 months, or maybe they're a seasonal operator where they dry off cows and some milk in some months to produce seasonally. And we would want to keep all of those types of farms. If they produced milk in all 12 months, or they produced seasonally, but they were in operation all year, those are the ones we want to collect information for. However, if they entered or exited the dairy business in 2021, we don't need to collect data on those farms. And so you would just go ahead and skip to section W if they weren't producing all year, either all 12 months or seasonally. Okay. And so that's question 4, where we ask whether they exited or entered the dairy business in 2021. We need for them to have been in business all year if we're going to collect their cost and returns estimates. If they weren't in business all year, then that's going to distort our cost and returns estimates for that particular farm, as far as what our total production costs and returns would have been had they been in business all year. Question number 5 asks about inventory of dairy cattle. It's asking about milk cows and breeding bulls at both the beginning and ending of the year. Question number 6 asks, was the operation transitioning into certified organic milk production in 2021? So while they may not have been selling milk, organic milk that year, certainly their cost is going to be different if they were transitioning. And so we need to know about those if they were transitioning into certified organic milk production in 2021. And then question 7 asks whether they produced certified organic milk in 2021. A number of the producers in this survey will have been producing organic milk. We oversampled this year organic so that we can estimate separate cost of production for organic versus conventional milk. If you look back the last few times we have collected data on dairy farms, we have oversampled organic farms, and on the ERS website we've been providing cost and returns estimates for organic. And so this particular question will allow us to separate those organic from the conventional dairy farms. Question number 8, if they answered yes, that they did produce organic milk, certified organic milk, we're asking about what the user fees that were charged by organic certifiers are. That's in total dollars there. And then finally, in that section, we ask them to choose from a list of the most difficult aspect of certified organic milk production. And this is basically, it's a research question that will go into any research reports that we're able to produce with regard to organic milk production. Some of the different aspects that we're asking about are in terms of whether they were difficult or not, raising grains or forage, pasture management, finding grains or forage, and their higher cost of production. There are 9 different aspects that we ask about there. Okay. Any questions about section N before I move forward? Okay. Let's go now to sections O and P. Section O asks about purchases of dairy animals. Question 1 is a table that accounts for the type, the number, and the amount spent for all the dairy animals that were purchased by type in 2021. Some of the different dairy types are dairy animal types are milk cows, replacement heifers weighing 500 pounds or more, replacement heifers weighing under 500 pounds, breeding bulls, and others. So in that table, we're asking how many head were purchased, and then we also ask what was the total amount spent on these dairy cattle. And so from this basis, we can develop the costs associated with purchasing of these animals. So it's very important that we get this table fully filled out and completed. Question 2 asks the number of replacement heifers that were born on the operation that were kept for breeding. And of these, we're asking how many of those were raised on the operation. And then we're also asking for the amount spent to have them raised on another operation if they had them raised on another operation. This amount then we can use as a cost as well in our cost and returns. You know, a few minutes ago, I said that we weren't asking about what it cost to produce the animals on another operation, but instead we're asking what did we spend to have them raised on another operation, and this is where we're asking that question. Okay, so section P is on sales and other income. In table P1, we're asking for any of the dairy animals in 2021. We want to ask about how many did the operation sell for these different types of animals? What was the total amount received for sales? And then what was the average weight per head for those animals sold? And some of the different categories of animals, we have sale of cull cows, we have sale of all milk cows, including dry cows, replacement heifers, 500 pounds or more, breeding bulls, and several other ones as well. If there are any questions about those categories, I'm happy to address those. Please do not, though, include marketing charges that are associated with dairy cattle sales. You know, when we're looking at column 3 there, where we ask what was the total amount received for sales in 2021, we don't want the marketing charges there because we've already collected that information in section H, question number 34. So we just want to know what was the amount received less any marketing charges. Okay. And then question P2, it's other income, it's the amount received for renting space to other dairy operations. Okay, before I move to section Q, do we have any questions on sections O or P, purchases, sales, or other income? Okay, let's move to section Q. This is dairy housing. Okay, so section Q, we're asking about all kinds of different, the barns that are used to house dairy cattle on the operation in 2021. We have multiple different types of housing buildings of the same type can be reported in this table. The different types of facilities we're looking at are, we have categories like stanchion or tie stall barns, we have loafing or loose housing barns, freestall barns, and others that you'll see listed down there. And for each one of those, we want to know about the frame type. Was it wood, concrete, masonry, steel, pole barn? We want to know about the floor type. Was it concrete, dirt, or something else? As far as the manure handling system, was it a flush gutter? Was it a scrape gutter? Was it manual or something else? For the manure storage system, we'd like to know whether it was a pit, a lagoon, slurry, dry stack, or something else. And all of those codes are listed in the table. So you can just, if you can ask them about what type and just fill in using those codes. And then also we need to know how many total head can all of those facilities house at one time. Okay, we use this information to develop our costs as well. What we need to know is what the is the capacity of the barn, how it was built, et cetera. And then we have information on what it costs to build these types of all these different types of facilities that we can then use in our cost and returns analysis. So if we have this data, we can then develop those costs. Question 2 asks the year that the newest dairy cattle housing facility was built. And then question 3 asks the number of calf hutches or super calf hutches that were used in 2021. The difference in a calf hutch and a super calf hutch is that super calf hutches typically house, well, they house more calves, and they have various other features, but it's usually, I think my understanding of super calf houses is at hutches is that they house more calves in one instead of just one calf in each hutch. Question number 4, we're asking about various technologies that were used on the operation. These are just yes, no questions. Did they use artificial insemination, embryo transplants, or sexed semen? Did they keep individual cow production records? Did they have milking cow units that had automatic takeoffs? Did they use nutritionists to design mixes or purchase feed? What we do with these are certainly technologies that can help to explain why some of these farms might have higher or lower costs or higher or lower returns. And so it's important that we're able to understand these technologies, and we can sort of link them to these costs and returns. Another thing that we like to do is we be able to track these over time. We've asked most of these over a number of years, and so you can sort of track how the uptake of these technologies over time. And we've included those in some of our ERS reports as well as journal articles. The next question is the acres of land used in the dairy operation. And I think one of the things I want to make sure we understand here in terms of acres of land, we're including all the pasture, because the pasture is used directly for the dairy cows. Any pasture that's used for dairy cattle. We're including any corrals, any building sites, and any manure storage as well. What we're not including in this land, though, for the dairy operation, any land that was used to produce crops that were fed to dairy cattle, and any acres to which dairy manure was applied. We're accounting for the crops, as I mentioned earlier. We are, if they're producing crops to feed to dairy cattle, we account for that in terms of the market value of that of corn or whatever that's being fed. We're not accounting for the cost of it, of what it costs to produce, but the market value of it. So we don't need to know the land costs associated with producing that corn. And so we would overstate cost if we included that cropland in there, just because of the way that we're accounting for the costs here. Okay, so please do not include the acres used to produce the crops. Any questions on section Q, dairy housing, before I move forward? Okay, so section R is milking facilities and practices. And so then in this case, we're going to be asking about, are we milking these cows in a barn facility, or are we milking these cows in a parlor type facility, in a dairy parlor? And these are, some different systems, dairy milk production systems. Question R1 is, were any cows milked in barn facilities during 2021? And if yes, the barn should have been reported in section Q as one of, for instance, a stanchion facility, or one of the other types. We asked then the method that's used to milk those cows in that barn facility. Is it an around the barn pipeline? Is it a pail unit or bucket milkers? Is it robotic? Okay. And so we need to know the method used. Then we ask the total number of stalls in those facilities and the number of milking units in those facilities. Okay, so those are for the barn facilities. If we have that information, then we can develop some good cost and returns estimates, because we already have information on the barn from section Q. We're collecting a little bit more information here. But what about those operations that use a dairy parlor? Well, question 2 gets at those. We asked the question, were any cows milked in a milking parlor during 2021? Yes or no? We then asked how many milking parlors were used. We ask about the parlor type of the largest of those milking parlors. There are a number of different types, whether it's herringbone, parallel, side opening, carousel, flat barn, swing. Ask the producer which type of facility milk parlor was used that was of the largest on the farm. We then ask about the frame type of the largest facility. Was the frame type wood? Was it concrete masonry? Was it pole? Was it steel? What was it? We then ask about the manure handling system of the largest parlor. Was it a flush gutter? Was it a scrape gutter? Was it manual? And then the manure storage facility of the largest milking parlor. Was it a pit? Was it pit? Was it lagoon? Was it a slurry tank? Was it a dry stack? Okay. We then ask about the number of stalls in all of the parlors. And that's the total number of milking units and the stalls in all of the milking parlors. And then also the total number of milking units in all of the milking parlors. So if you had 3 milking parlors on this farm, we want to know the total number of all stalls and the total number of milking units in all of those parlors, not just in the largest parlor. We've been talking about the largest parlor in these last few questions, but here we want to know all of the parlors. We also ask how many of those were robotic in those milking parlors. You may run into some questions about this with respect to robotic. The robotic operations, the ones that I've been most familiar with have been in barn facilities where there is a box where the cattle are milked, and they go into a robotic area where and then they come back out into the barn facility. Some farmers would consider that a barn facility, and then there may be some that would consider that there may be parlor. Please, though, I guess the best way to do it is just to ask the question and not to have a repeat here between the barn robotic versus the robotic in the parlors, and to make a note out to the side if there's any question about it, so we can understand a little if there's a discrepancy there. We'd really appreciate that. This is still a pretty new technology, and people are thinking about it in a number of different ways, I think, in terms of parlors and barn facilities. Okay, and then question H there is when and what year was the newest milking parlor built? Okay, question R3 is just about some different production practices. It's a few additional production practices, technologies that allow us to understand more about why production costs may be higher or lower, and why returns may be higher or lower in some of these farms. And these are also technologies and production practices that we can track over time. Milking more than greater than or equal to 3 times a day, computerized milking systems, BST. Shouldn't have a lot of BST administered to the cow herds. That was more of that was a number of years back, but there may run across some that are still administering BST. And then the percentage of dairy herd of the following breeds. Any questions about milking facilities and practices at this point before I move to dairy feed and pasture? Okay, I don't see the chat, but I'm assuming I did see a couple of things pop up, but I don't think those were questions specifically about this. So if they were, please let me know, just interrupt. Okay, let's move on to dairy feed and pasture. We have a couple of tables that we ask to be filled out for dairy feed. One is for homegrown dairy feed. The other is for purchased dairy feed. We complete table 1, question S1 for homegrown, and question S2, table S2 for purchased feed. And all the feed codes that we would use are listed up there at the top. And those are the ones that will be used for both questions S1 and S2. Now, if there's a paper copy being used, the table S2 is actually on the next page. So you have to, one would have to go back and refer back to the previous page for those feed type codes, as well as the dairy feed facility type codes. But let's say a little bit about homegrown type feed. What we're asking for is the quantities of homegrown and feed and the storage facilities for all of the homegrown feeds. As I mentioned before, all of these homegrown feed, what we're looking at for these, if they fed corn, if they fed soybean meal, if they fed whatever, we want to be able to know what they fed. And then we're going to use a market price to be able to determine what it costs to feed that homegrown feed. We're not looking at what it costs to produce that homegrown feed. So please fill this out. I want to make sure that this is all filled out for all of the different homegrown feeds that they're feeding, because this goes directly into our cost of production. And if we're missing some of those homegrown feeds and their quantities, then it would understate what the cost of that of feeding these animals would be, what was. For purchased feeds, we collect purchased feeds in a couple of different places. This is where we drill down on what the different purchased feeds were, whether it's a commercial feed mix, or if they're purchasing corn from somewhere else and feeding the dairy animals. But for any feed that's purchased, we'd like to know what the total amount of that feed was, and then what was the total amount spent. Can go back and sort of cross-check back to the question H6A, back in section H6A, where we asked about the cost of purchased dairy feed. And if they're underreporting here, for instance, we could ask, okay, is there another feed that's being fed as compared to, because it's a bit lower than what was reported back in section H. Relative to the last time, we didn't have soybean meal included in the feed codes last time. We do have it this time. All right, let's talk a little more about dairy feeds in terms of pasture. Okay. Question 3 asks, did this operation use pasture or cropland, such as corn stalks, to graze the dairy cattle? If yes, we have the table that we would like to have completed. And if no, then they can just go and skip down to question 7. This is very important that we get. If they're using pasture, we need to be able to value that pasture. And you basically value that pasture at the rental value of pasture. Okay, so we ask about, did the operation use pasture or cropland? We're asking for that table to report any type of, report for each type of pasture and cropland used to graze. We want to know the acres. We want to know the acres rented or leased, the dollars spent to rent or lease, and the acres irrigated. This is broken out into several different types of pasture. We have native or permanent pasture. We have planted or improved pasture, small grains pasture, crop residue, or other grazed forages. And so we really need this information. Appreciate people filling that out fully. We then asked the number of months that the milk cows were grazed. This can be year round in in some of the southern regions where in some of the southern regions we can graze year round. In more northerly regions, it would not be feasible for cows to be grazed year round and to be able to get forage off of that pasture. So we'd like to know how many months they're grazing on pasture. And then for those months that they are grazing, what is the percentage of the total forage ration that they're obtaining from pasture during those grazing months? Is it 1 to 24%, 25 to 49%, et cetera? And question 6. We've used this in the past in terms of being able to separate out pasture-based dairy operations from conventional dairy operations that are not pasture-based, and be able to compare those costs and returns across those types of operations. And it's always been interesting, the kinds of results that we've been able to get from those in terms of farm size and region and et cetera. Question number, one other thing I do want to note is that if it's a certified organic dairy farm, they should have some pasture, because organic rules, USDA organic rules do require that organic dairy operations to provide access to pasture for cattle. Okay, one more question in this section is whether bedding was produced or on the operation or obtained for free, and if so, what was the value of that bedding if it was sold? Okay, any questions on this section, section S, dairy feed and pasture? It's a very important section for us because, of course, dairy feed is the single largest expense on a dairy farm, and so it's important that we get a good understanding of what these feed costs are. All right, let's move on to section T. That's dairy manure. Now, manure storage facilities were reported in section Q, column 5, in that question 1. And as well as back in section R, along with the facilities that they serve. Here we're asking a bit more drill down questions on dairy manure. And so question T1 asks you to select the code that describes the manure handling system for the majority of the manure. Was it a pasture-based system? Was it an open dry lot system, an open lot slurry system, barn-based alley or gutter system, et cetera? And then table 2 asks us to list out the types of dairy manure storage facilities. And for each type, the numbers, the total capacity, the construction materials, the age, and how often the manure is removed from the facility. So we have some storage site codes for manure, and we have some construction material codes as well above for that. Question T3 asks how often the manure was removed from the dairy housing and holding facilities. And was it daily? Was it weekly? Was it monthly? Was it yearly or something else? Then question T4 was was a system used to collect and dispose of methane from the dairy manure storage facility? And if yes, was it used for electricity generation or flared for disposal? Question T5 asks, was dairy manure applied to fields on the operation, yes or no? And if so, how many acres was the manure applied to? That's question T5A. And then question 6 asks, was commercial fertilizer applied to the same acres on this operation on which dairy manure was applied? And if so, were commercial fertilizer applications adjusted based on nutrients provided by the dairy manure? This is a research question that we're asking, in terms of just understanding better how commercial fertilizer applications might be impacted by dairy manure applications. Any questions on the dairy manure section before I move on? All right, let's move to section U, vehicles, trucks, and tractors. And on this slide, I'm going to be talking about trucks. Question U1 asks us to report the number of pickups. Those are anything that's a half-ton pickup or smaller, cars and SUVs used in dairy production. These are farm use vehicles. If they were used for the dairy operation, we want to know about it. But we're basically lumping all of the smaller pickups, the trucks, and the cars into one category, and SUVs into one category. And we want to know how many total miles were those vehicles driven in 2021. Of those miles, how much was for farm use? And of those farm use miles, how much was for dairy production? And we use this in terms of being able to allocate those expenses associated with those small trucks, cars, SUVs to the dairy operation. So it's important that we get this information for our cost and returns analysis. Question 3 asks about truck use. And this can be a little misleading because, we're not asking about any trucks that are half-ton or smaller. These are for any trucks that are greater than half-ton, three-quarter ton, or greater. And so on each of these, we're asking for any trucks that were used for hauling dairy cattle, anything that was used for hauling feed, or any other use for the dairy operation. We do say include trucks used by contractors. This is really what we're looking at here is for production contracts. I'm not sure we're going to see any production or many production contracts in dairy production. So this is probably not something that, trucks for contractors that we're really going to be looking at here, given that we're talking about production contracts here. As far as this, we want you to list the numbers of trucks and the total miles driven for dairy production. And we have this broken out by single axle trucks, tandem axle trucks, semi trucks, and other trucks. Okay, let's move to tractors. We're asking about any tractors that are used for dairy production. But we do want to exclude any tractors that are used only to produce dairy feed. And the reason for that is that, as I've talked about with respect to dairy feed, we're interested in what was produced on the farm in terms of dairy feed, but we value that feed at its market value. We're not looking at what it costs to produce the feed. So including tractors in there that were used to produce that feed would lead to an overestimate of our costs associated with tractors. Okay, so we do include tractors that are used for feed processing. If different feeds are being brought in and we're using the tractor in terms of feed processing, mixing, that sort of thing, it would be included, but not in terms of producing the feed, producing the crop itself. All right. We include also any tractors that are used for manure hauling, hauling dairy cattle, and any other dairy production uses. We ask also for the percentage of the total farm uses for dairy production in terms of using those tractors. We have several different horsepower categories that we ask you to list as well, so that we can break those out. We have costs for all of the different sizes of tractors, and we can then determine what those costs would be for the farm on the basis of the horsepower. Let's move on to machinery and equipment, section V. We ask you to please list all the feed handling, manure handling, and other machinery and equipment used on or at the dairy enterprise. We have machine feed handling equipment codes. We have manure handling equipment codes and other machine equipment codes there. We're asking how many of each of these machines were used, and then what percentage of that machine, the total farm use, was for dairy production. Okay, that wraps up all of the questions for the 2021 ARMS dairy version. I know took quite a while to get through all of those, and I appreciate your patience in going through them. Do we have any questions at this point about the survey? About any of those questions?
Hey, Jeff, you got one in the chat here.
Okay.
Has there ever been a discussion about taking the later sections of the dairy version or other livestock versions as a standalone survey that could be done during the ARMS 2 timeframe? Something like that might reduce respondent burden during phase 3.
It's a good question. I don't know if that's ever been considered or not, but it's certainly something that we can consider, look into. Kind of have to think about all of the the ways that might be. Yeah, so it's something we definitely should consider. Anything else? Okay. Let me move forward here. I've got 3 practice examples. These could take a bit of time. We can go through some of these if you guys would like to, or we can go through 1 or 2 of them. I could go either way on this. Maybe it makes sense to go through 1 of them, and then if people would like to see another one, we can do that. How does that, David? What would you prefer given the time at this point?
We probably have time to at least do 1 of them. I know we didn't schedule a break for this session, so this is the time we normally would break, but so I don't want to keep people too much past that. We can probably have time for at least 1 of these, and then
okay.
We did have another question in the chat. Are there any letters of support or articles out there that could be cited where a producer group is actively encouraging their members to complete the commodity specific versions, even if it's just something on their website about it?
We have reached out to the corn and rice groups, and I do know that some of the commodity groups, they have been encouraging completion of phase 2, and I believe is probably as well as phase 3. We've reached out to them. I'm not as clear on the dairy at this point. It's a good question. Does anybody else have anything to say about that one?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I know we were trying, we had the late push to try to encourage for phase 2. Each of the groups that we talked to did know that we were going to be coming back for phase 3 as well, and said that they would be willing to encourage. So that's something, if I get with Jim and others in our public affairs to at least put that together. There have been things that have been going out. I mean, tweets, memos to association members. And I know some in the field offices have shared as well. I know in the Delta, they had a couple things in regards to rice. So yeah, there have been things that have been happening. And I guess there's a way we can collectively put those together and share. We will work with our public affairs office to do that.
Okay, thanks, Tori. Was there something else in the chat there? Let's
Well,
see,
one more
I don't see it.
Jeff, we did, we are targeting the National Milk Federation. And so there's supposed to be some PR stuff for them to put out for milk. Jim the first day he shared some of that stuff that is already going out. We'll get a whole list. He's sending me a whole bunch of stuff so I know stuff is happening, is getting out there. I think we just need to make you aware of what all that is. So I'm sure Tori will be sharing something or Jim, either one of them.
Okay, thanks, Gerald. Okay, unless we have any other questions at this point, let me move to one of these practice examples. I'll choose the 400 cow Midwestern dairy, and then you guys will have access to these slides if you want to go through the other ones individually. I think that probably makes the most sense. Here's the 50 cow Northeastern dairy, and you can see how it was filled out here. Let's go through the 400 cow Midwestern dairy. This is a dairy where milk cows are housed in 4 freestall barns, each holding 100 cows. 3 of the barns have pole frames, the other has a wood frame, and all floors are concrete. A scrape gutter is used to move the manure from each barn into a slurry tank storage facility. And then the wood frame barn was built in 1995, while the 3 pole barns were built when the operation expanded in 2001. Calves are housed using 40 individual calf hutches. The operation uses artificial insemination and computerized feed delivery, keeps individual cow records, and its milkers have automatic takeoffs. It does not have holding pens with udder washers or use the services of a nutritionist. The dairy building site covers about 5 acres, while 500 acres of corn silage is grown to feed the cows and apply dairy manure. So instantly on land, what are we going to be saying here about how many acres would be included for the dairy operation? Would it be, anybody want to say 5? Would it be 5 acres or would it be 505? You want to put it in the chat?
Hey Jeff, when we're training on this, I'm always looking at making sure that I say dairy enterprise versus dairy operations. So I think that's kind of a key distinction here to make. Do you mean the dairy enterprise? And I'd say 5 acres.
Yeah, the enterprise.
The operation
right.
might be more.
Yeah, good. And we see here, we also have a 5 acres in the chat. So yeah, it is the dairy enterprise. And so 5 acres is correct. We're not including those 500 acres of corn silage. The operation has a 20 stall herringbone parlor built in 2001 with a pole frame, concrete floor, and scrape gutter to move manure to the slurry tank. All stalls have a milking unit. The milking parlor was built at the same time as the 3 pole housing barns. The herd is all Holstein, milked twice daily, and a computerized milking system is used to gather data, but RBST is not used. Let's look at how we would fill this out. Just at least 2 pages of it, not the entire survey, but we're gonna look at 2 pages of it, the facilities. So for this farm, you're gonna look up here at for the dairy facility. It's a freestall barn. There are 4 of them. And so you can see down there, column 1 of the table 1, 4 facilities. What is the frame of the largest facility? It is a pole frame, and so it's 4. What's the floor type of the largest facility? It is concrete, so that would be code 1. What's the manure handling system of the largest facility? It's a scrape gutter, so 2. And then what's the manure storage system of the largest facility? It's a slurry tank, it's 3. And then how many total head can all of those house at one time? 400 head. In what year was the newest dairy cattle housing facility built? 2001. That was listed in what we discussed in the narrative there. How many calf hutches are super calf hutches? 40. And then you can see down below where we have checked yes for artificial insemination, computerized feed delivery system, individual cow production records, and units without automatic takeoffs, but no for holding pen with an udder washer and using a nutritionist to design feeds or purchase feed. And then question 5, we had 5 acres that were used for the dairy operation. The dairy enterprise is Andy said here just a minute ago. Okay, questions about this page, filling this page out. All right, let's go to the next page, question, section R, milking facilities and practices. Were any of the cows milked in barn facilities? This was not a barn facility milking system. This was a parlor milking facility. So the answer to that is no. And so you go ahead and skip down to question 2. Were any cows milked in a milking parlor during 2021? Yes. And how many milking parlors were used? We had just one milking parlor, and it was a herringbone milking parlor. So question B would be code 1. It was the frame type was pole, and so code number 4. The manure handling system was scrape gutter. The manure storage facility was slurry tank, so code 3. And what was the total number of stalls in all milking parlors? 20. And the same number of milking units in all milking parlors. And it was not robotic. So question GI is 0. None of them were robotic. In what year was the newest milking parlor built? 2001. And then we had a few more questions on technologies there. They didn't milk 3 or more times per day. They did have computerized milking systems to gather data, but RBST was not used, and 100% of the cows were Holstein. So that's how you would fill it out for that particular type of farm. Okay. I think I'll just leave the other ones unless people would like to see one more example. And then people can look, unless somebody wants to do that, and I can do another one. Okay, hearing no request for that, I'll let you guys look at this. You'll have the access to these slides. So these data are published in several different places. Our data product, you can see there, we have a corn, rice, and dairy research publications, and then you can contact me if you have questions. Okay. And so that ends my presentation.